I'm going to take you on a journey to the future. Now, I'm going to start with a macro view. I'm often identified as a futurist. I identify as a futurist. Of course, you know the meaning behind futurist, right? Or the what it means. It's the joke is that it means never being wrong today. Having said that, if you've been following the work I've done in the banking space, I've been talking about the future of banking and payments and so forth for well over 2 decades now, and I'd like to think that I've got a bit of a track record in this thing. But also, being a futurist means you're always watching technological developments, new technologies that come along, and you're sort of extrapolating where that goes. And so when we talk about futurism and forecasts of the future, these are not predictions. Futurists aren't fortune tellers. We are not trying to predict the future in that sense. What we are is trying to show you a zone of possibilities, or a zone of probabilities, if you like. That's what super forecasting as a futurist means. There are some things that we have high degree of certainty in terms of impact. One of those is, of course, climate change, the impact of climate change. Artificial intelligence, which David talked about this morning. We know that AI is going to have a significant impact on society. I want to dive into some of those impacts today. And so you can follow some of these trends, and based on how we've seen technology adoption in the past, based on human behavioural traits, based on philosophy, sociology, ethnographic research, anthropology, you can bring all of these things into sort of trend analysis and forecasting in respect to this. So that's what's going on in my head every day when I'm sort of trying to work out where we're going. I want to sort of take you on a bit of a journey in respect to some of those things, and also talk to you obviously about the future of banking. Now, when we talk about the next 20 or 30 years, one of the things we've already seen as a result of the pandemic, but to be honest, it was happening before the pandemic, is that economic uncertainty is increasing around the world. This is happening primarily because of inequality, the gap between the rich and the poor. If you've been watching the stats on this, during the pandemic, the wealth of the world's billionaires surpassed $10 trillion for the first time. In the United States, the top 1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90%. Now, if you look at basic economic theory in terms of what the purpose of an economy is for, then economists would argue that you need GDP growth, you need full employment, good trade surplus. These are the measures we use for economic measuring the activity of an economy based on the economist's view of the world. But at its most basic function, what is the economy for? Well, you should argue that it's to look after the needs of citizens. In that respect, the US, as the world's most powerful economy, is a total failure, right? Because most, 2/3 of bankruptcies in the United States are because of the cost of healthcare. Prior to the pandemic, the US had 600,000 people homeless. Today, that figure is 3.5 million. 30 million Americans are facing either foreclosure or eviction because of rent price increases today. In the US, you've got 3 million homeless, and you have 17 million vacant homes. This sort of boggles the mind that you can have an economy which is supposed to be the best economy in the world, but on a functional basis, it can't provide healthcare, education, or housing, and in many cases, food now, for its citizens. This is sort of an epic failure in respect to basic economics. And some would argue in respect to capitalism itself. Although, you raise that issue in the United States, it's like attacking Christianity, attacking capitalism, right? Then you also have, obviously, the pandemic. We don't believe COVID is going to be the last major pandemic we face in the next 20 or 30 years. One of the side effects of climate change is glacial melt. And one of the things that happens with glacial melt is we're releasing primordial viruses that our immune system hasn't dealt with in tens of thousands of years. And so we expect the number of pandemics we have to deal with to increase over the next coming 30 or 40 years. Then you've got climate change and artificial intelligence as impactors. So all of this creates massive uncertainty where people are saying, we don't know what comes next. And, I don't have as much money in my bank account as I used to, and I'm not making as, I'm making good money, but it's not going as far as it used to. What's the world for my children going to be like with climate change and all of this? This is the uncertainty that we see in the world today. How is this uncertainty reflected in sort of the public sphere? Well, if you measure protests globally, that's a pretty good way to measure if people are happy with government or with policy. And protests from the start of this 21st century have increased to 200% in terms of frequency, right? Based on the 50-year average of the 20th century. But they've increased 1,000% in participation. The crowds turning out for protests are much bigger. Now, again, some people would say, well, that's social media has had that impact. Yeah, social media has probably had an impact on this, but why are people protesting? Because, functionally they're not happy or they're worried about the future. The populist movement, the rise of Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, Le Pen, all of this is because people are grasping for a solution. They want something, they want someone to bring order and control to the chaos. But unfortunately, a lot of these things, because of the way we think about markets and capitalism and so forth, the impact of climate change and artificial intelligence on economic uncertainty are going to be far greater than they need to be, because we prioritise making money and profits rather than addressing problems like climate change. Why do we have 10 million people a year die from air pollution, from fossil fuels? Because we've prioritised profitability of fossil fuel companies over the health of our cities, right? And this has been the case for decades. We made that decision. But the world of 2050 is going to be quite different. And we have the technology to address a lot of the problems that we're facing. By the 2050, we're going to look at, like when we talk about economies today, we talk about the developed world versus the developing world. In the 2050s, we'll talk about the smart world versus the dumb world, right? Smart economies versus traditional economies. And this means that economies that are most efficient, economically speaking, are those with high levels of automation, because those high levels of automation will produce improvements in resource allocation, lowering the cost of government, lowering the cost of the provision of basic services and so forth, right? This is really critical. So smart economies are going to be, how we look at the world's most effective economies. And the number one economy in the world in 2050 is obviously going to be China. We know this because on the current trajectory, China will surpass the US as the world's greatest economy in the early 2030s. Now, Americans hate to hear this. And they say it's propaganda. And you can read an article in Reuters or Bloomberg weekly about why this is never going to happen, why the US is going to maintain the number one spot. But let me just tell you a little fact, right? A couple of little facts that show why this is obviously going to happen. In China now than in the US. China has more private wealth holdings than the United States. And if you look at the banks in China, Chinese banks, and there are less banks in China than in the US, but Chinese banks hold more tier one capital than twice the tier one capital of the US banks and twice the asset base of the US banks. So it's not even close in terms of this. They're investing more in artificial intelligence and technology. For every one PhD graduate that graduates in the United States, in China, 8 graduate in China. It's a numbers game, the future of smart economies. And the US has a significant disadvantage against China when it comes to basic technology implementation in society. And that is, you have to pay to get access to education in the United States. If you want to be able to compete against China in the fields of science, technology, engineering, math, you have to make all that education free to the tertiary level. And the US can't conceptualize of a free access to education system in the United States. So, one great example of this gap opening up between the US and China is the implementation of digital money, which is obviously a foundation requirement for a smart economy based on artificial intelligence in the 21st century. China started trialling central bank digital currencies back in 2014. And if you want to know why they banned crypto from the Chinese market, it was because very early they recognized that if they wanted to displace the United States in terms of, the petrodollar and the US dollar as the dominant global currency, that their window of opportunity was the transfer to digital monetization. And to do that, they needed to be dominant and not have crypto compete. That's the mindset in China. So it's already in 15 provinces. Over 40 cities now have CBDCs implemented. $100 billion in transactions already. Over 6 million merchants already using the CBDC. During the pandemic, if you lived in Macau, the CBDC was how you received stimulus payments. And you could receive that into your Alipay wallet or your Tencent WeChat Pay wallet, or you could receive a debit card. In the US, they were sending people checks, paper checks, right? Last time I checked, it was the 21st century, right? But and so this is where the gap is opening up, in terms of sort of thinking about, the US is resistant to things that challenge the status quo from an industry perspective, from a market perspective, whereas China is realizing that, the world's economies of the future are going to operate on different rule set. Now, the Belt and Road is China's biggest investment to date. $8 trillion already invested into the Belt and Road to integrate supply chain automation across the planet. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because they have the rail infrastructure, the shipping ports, the airports and so forth. They've already built, ready to sort of automate supply chain around the world to keep supplying the Chinese economy and keep Chinese products and services being shipped around the world. And the investment they've made in these economies around the world is incredible. Now, obviously there are sort of geopolitical, economic colonialism concerns and things like that. But at its fundamental basis, China sees this as a mechanism for creating trade. Now, what happens with the Belt and Road when China says you need to use a central bank digital currency to trade with China? That's when things get really interesting because now you have a mechanism for de-dollarization. If you want to trade for China, you've got to use a mobile wallet and you've got to use a CBDC. And yeah, you can use US dollars, but you've got to transfer them into CBDCs, into E1, right? This is where things get really interesting. And, the US can say whatever they like, but when you have highly autonomous economies, when you have automated supply chain, the US dollar won't work because you need programmable money, you need smart contracts. And this is why fundamentally China's development of the CBDC puts them so far ahead on this sort of smart economy measure that we're talking about. So when we look at the effect of this on the global economy, it could be very interesting. But who's not going to want to trade with the world's #1 economy? And when China comes out and says the US system has failed because China is now #1, that the US form of capitalism is broken, and they've got some pretty good proof points for that, and that their system is more efficient than the US system of democracy, then what's the US's options left at that point? Well, maybe only military use at that point. All of the economic levers they need to pull to be able to compete with China, they really haven't got the ability to do that anymore. Otherwise, they would have. You know, look at how difficult it was to just get the infrastructure bill passed in the United States. You know, whereas look at the investment that China's made in infrastructure there. Now, AI is one of those 4 elements of disruption that we talked about, in the future. And when we talk about AI, we talk about 3 broad stages of development of artificial intelligence. You know, what we have right now is machine learning, the ability of computers to learn, recognize patterns and so forth. Pattern recognition using image technology is a big part of this, but the next stage is what we call artificial general intelligence. And this is where we talk about computers that can mimic humans in various ways. Now, we have seen some incredible progress in components of the future of AGI, such as natural language processing. Now we have computers that can understand the spoken word better than other humans in terms of accuracy. Like take a thing like translation from English to Dutch or something like that. We now have these algorithms that can perform that faster and better than humans. We are seeing in the medical diagnosis arena, we're seeing computers outperform human doctors in terms of diagnostics and so forth. Now you combine all of these different elements and you aggregate them together, and we may be able to approximate some form of intelligence that can pretend to be a human very effectively. It could be convincing enough to pass the Turing test, which is seen as sort of the historical hurdle for that sort of intelligence. But it's going to be quite a different intelligence from the way we are as humans. And that opens up a whole lot of philosophical issues. How do we live with another intelligence on this planet? Are AIs going to have the same motivations as humanity? Probably not. That doesn't mean they're going to be malevolent, but it also doesn't mean they're going to be benevolent. We don't know. The one thing we should be doing, we should be trying to ensure that the integration of artificial intelligence into our society is done in some measured way. We aren't doing that. We're not setting regulatory frameworks for the introduction of artificial intelligence. We're not introducing ethical codes of conduct that can be coded into AI to ensure that AIs respect the sanctity of human life and things like that. Why? Because humanity tends to be quite short-term in our planning and thinking. Look at climate change. We put it off. Don't worry about it. If it becomes a problem down the line, we can attack it. And here we are. This year, 65 million eco-refugees as a result of climate change. Obviously, the Pakistan issue was a big part of that, but that's just an illustration of how our short-termism, our view on the next quarter, the next year's financial results, maybe the next election cycle, that's about as much as we think about the future. But humanity didn't used to be like that. We used to build these huge cathedrals, in Europe that would take hundreds of years to build. The Great Wall of China, the pyramids. These are projects that took generations to complete. So what happened to humanity to make us focus on just such short-term goals instead of longer-term, sort of greater aspirations? Well, the answer is capitalism, right? But when we get to hyper-intelligent AI, all bets are off. What happens when there is a greater intelligence than humans on the planet? We've always sort of had these movies about aliens coming that are super technological and come in and take over and things like that. But the reality is probably the intelligence that it has the ability to take over the planet is going to be something that we've created ourselves in the form of AI. But the world of 2050s, with the technology advancements, gets pretty interesting. We have free energy. Essentially, energy costs go down to zero. That's already happening with renewables, but when we throw in next generation nuclear, when we throw in fusion generators and things like that, the net basis is we have incredible capabilities in terms of energy at almost zero cost to society. This enables innovation. You know, energy's always been a very big part of our ability as a human race to expand our horizons and grow. But that requires us also retooling the energy grids that we have. We've seen this, the pressure on the energy systems in Europe as a result of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. But in the US, it's going to cost at least $2.5 trillion to retool the energy markets there. And that's just switching from fossil to renewables. It doesn't include battery storage technology and all of those other things that we incorporate. But when we look at, sort of adapting the system, it requires us to think very differently about energy production and the sort of grid systems that we have. So we are going to need massive battery storage if we're going to make sun and wind energy work. Now there are, new next generation thorium reactors, nuclear reactors and so forth, but renewables are always going to be a big part of the future of our energy because they're such low cost. And just like David pointed out today with Moore's Law, there is a Moore's Law effect happening in solar right now, where the cost of solar generation is reducing, by half every 2 or 3 years. Which means today already solar is the cheapest form of energy production on the planet. But capturing that energy and storing it is a problem we need at a grid level. So this is one of the really interesting things. If you've been involved at all in the crypto market, hopefully not at the moment, with FTX, but we've had this big argument about decentralization versus centralization. Well, the energy market is a great example of the need for decentralization. Yes, we're still going to need national grids to balance power, particularly if you have sun shining on one part of your country and not the other, where you can transfer that energy. That reduces your storage capacity requirements. But we are going to have to distribute energy production into our cities and homes. One of the easiest ways to solve the problem of powering electric vehicles, for example, is putting rooftop solar on every residential home and putting a battery in a home. And the battery doesn't actually have to be a battery you put on the wall, like a Tesla power cell. It could actually be an electric vehicle. That could be your residential battery and be part of the energy grid in terms of storage systems. So this requires a decentralized view of energy production. But other systems are going to require centralization. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. Now, the really interesting effect of shifting towards solar and renewable is that it completely deconstructs the existing commodities market. 51% of global commodities trade today is energy: oil, gas, coal. And, we know how defensive those traditional industries are of changes to the system. They've been fighting this for 50 years, but this is largely inevitable. So what happens to the whole commodities market when half of the global commodities trade disappears with a shift to new forms of energy? That gets really interesting. But it gets even more interesting in the 2050s, because in the 2050s we have the technology to do things like asteroid mining. Right? Now, I'll give you an illustration. This one asteroid on the asteroid belt is called 16 Psyche, or Psyche 16 if you prefer. This one asteroid has enough rare earth metals, well, I guess they're called rare off-earth metals, not an asteroid, and precious metals like silver, gold, and so forth, titanium and so forth, that it is worth in today's terms $10 quintillion. That's one with 15 zeros after it. That one asteroid is worth 100,000 years at current GDP levels of economic activity. So in the 2050s, when we can mine asteroids, what happens to the remaining commodities market? Any precious metal, any raw materials are basically free at that point. Right? Now, you might say, but the cost of mining an asteroid, it's just, how are we ever going to afford that? Well, the biggest cost of mining an asteroid is getting out of Earth's gravity well. And even though Elon Musk, and he's going through a very hard time today, poor Elon with Twitter, but even Elon Musk over the last 20 years with SpaceX has reduced the cost to orbit by 98%. In the Apollo days, it was $50,000 to get a kilo of mass into orbit. The new Starship program they're working on is going to lower that to $100 per kilogram to orbit. But even with that, the costs are still very high. They're in the trillions of dollars. But once we set up a base on the moon, and we can mine helium-3 or water ice from the moon and turn that into rocket fuel, we can use the moon as a station or a base for now mining asteroids. And the cost of getting out to the asteroid belt becomes fractional from what it would be trying to launch a program like that from the Earth. So it is feasible based on the technology we have today, just developing at the rate we see it developing at. But, as I said, some systems require greater centralization, and the healthcare system is an example of that. In the 2050s, healthcare becomes not like we do today. You don't go to a doctor to get diagnosed for a sickness. In the 2050s, you have a health maintenance program. This is built up with genome data about you, gene therapy that eliminates certain diseases. You know, if you have in your genome a tendency from a family perspective towards Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or cardiac disease, we'll just eliminate these out of the genome. We'll turn off those genes or proteins, and eliminate. It's like a software bug, effectively, right? Now, we are using gene therapy already today, but in 15 to 20 years, this is going to become commonplace. We are already using 3D printing to create replacement organs. 3D bioprinting, they call this. Again, this is going to be a mature industry in the 2050s. And then we'll have sensors in real time that will be able to deliver a whole suite of information about your health. So when we combine this, gene therapy, better data models and so forth, now we're maintaining your health. And we will know you're sick well before you do. In respect to this, your smartphone or your smart cloud of intelligence that tracks you and helps you. And so, health becomes a maintenance program. If you want the top tier, the gold level, the platinum level of healthcare, it might involve longevity treatments, helping you to live longer. That's going to cost you a premium, but basic healthcare is going to be provided as a maintenance function of the economy. This requires centralization of all the health data to get the benefits of scale, and it requires, obviously, the use of artificial intelligence. All of this sort of intelligence we're talking about, whether it's energy production, whether it's better healthcare systems, better education systems, food production in the future, solving the problem of homelessness, all of that requires highly automated economies based on things like smart contracts and technologies based upon artificial intelligence. Smart contracts require digital money. They require digital identity. They require broad data structures. You can't have smart contracts based on US dollar. You must have programmable money. Though that is CBDCs, it's tokens, it's crypto, stable coins, and there may be other forms of digital money that we come up with. And, AIs may come up with their own currencies or ways to trade as well that we haven't necessarily thought of. So in these highly autonomous societies, guess what? We're going to have lots of robots running around. This is a clip from a movie called Mute on Netflix. If you haven't watched it, it's a German sci-fi program. And you can see the drones coming to these automated food stations, these pods, picking up these meals and these drones. You might have seen in Ready Player One delivering pizza. He wakes up in his apartment, the drone has dropped a meal off and it lets itself out the window in this example. Now, this is pretty cool, but it's not that far-fetched. Walmart, Amazon, others are already trialling drone delivery. By 2035, we're going to have more robots on the planet than humans. So my only advice is to you, be kind to robots. You just don't know what's going to happen in the future. Right? Now, this presents an enormous problem from the way we think about economics. This is classic supply and demand curve, right? This is Adam Smith, 1776, Wealth of Nations stuff. This is how we've thought about Economics 101 for the last 200 years. And it assumes that as demand for a product or service goes up, to increase supply, you need to increase labour participation. You need to throw more people into the factory to be able to produce the widgets to meet the demand and so forth. But in the 21st century, which are highly automated economies, it doesn't look like that anymore because supply is essentially a factor of processing cycles, machine access. It's no longer humans that are determining your ability to respond to demand, but your compute power, your energy systems, and so forth. This disconnects human capital from production cycles in the economy. This breaks this fundamental tenet of supply and demand economics that we've had for 200 years. And demand can increase a lot more rapidly in this environment. And that's what we've seen already happening with software-based companies and technology-based companies. If you look at, well, Facebook's probably not a great example, but if you look at Apple or Google as examples, compare them with the big industrials, the Exxons, the Saudi Aramco, JP Morgan Chase, etc. These technology companies produce profit at 10 or 20 times the rate of the blue chip industrials from the 20th century on a per employee basis. So they're a lot more capital efficient because of the use of technology. So this is what the market is demanding. We call it productivity increase. But ultimately, artificial intelligence is designed to take humans out of the labour force. Mm-hmm. And that presents us with a problem. Mm-hmm. How do we distribute wealth to the society when you're not working? And so this is techno-unemployment of the 21st century. Highly autonomous economies have high levels of technologically based unemployment. So you either have a breakdown of society with social unrest, or you have to come up with a solution like universal basic income or something like that to make sure that people don't starve and die because they can't work. And they can't work because the jobs just won't be there. Now, classic capitalists will say, well, hang on. Every time we've seen a new technology in the past, we've been able to create new jobs to replace the jobs that are lost by technology disruption. But we've never had a technology that can disrupt every job in every industry at the same time as we will with artificial intelligence. So all rules are off, all bets are off. And when you hear Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or Richard Branson, Bill Gates talk about the future, they all talk about universal basic income as a fait accompli, because they realise it's either UBI or it's the breakdown of social order as a result of technology innovation. Why? Because capital markets are not going to say, stop using artificial intelligence and keep humans employed. That's counterintuitive to the way capital markets work. Now, climate change is going to produce some pretty significant side effects, the most acute of them being food scarcity, access to food. We are seeing this right now with changes in arable land use. Over the last 50 years, we've lost 40% of our farm-growing land, our arable land, as a result of soil erosion, pollution, and so forth. And this is without the temperature sensitivity that we have from global warming. The Bordeaux region in France is well known for producing wine, right? Well, by the end of the 2030s, the Bordeaux region will be having about a 90% crop failure because of the slight increase in temperature there around wine-growing crops. Staples, corn, maize, and other things in other areas will be affected by this. Now, if you live in the UK, that's great news because, you're going to become a wine-producing country in Dover in Kent now, right? But it's, is it really great news, for the French wine-growing industry? And so food scarcity is going to become a big problem. And also sea level rise and food scarcity are going to produce eco-refugees. The estimates are between 300 million to 1.6 billion, right? Now, the 300 million estimate, it looks pretty low given that this year alone we've had 65 million eco-refugees, right? So it's probably more like 1 billion or 1.6 billion. At what point does the question, who's going to pay for that, become really irrelevant in our future society, right? Especially with this immense wealth that can be created by artificial intelligence. The argument for saying, well, that's socialism, that sort of really doesn't cut it anymore when you've got this immense wealth, but you can't solve these basic problems like giving people access to food or living standards. Which means that the markets are going to change posture. Companies will have to become brands that do good. Otherwise, they're going to become pariahs, And you can already see what's going to happen. We see these protests at the moment against fossil fuel companies and so forth. Imagine that in 15 years when the worst effects of climate change are starting to be felt. And it's not, we have the wildfires and the bushfires and the flooding and the extreme weather events and all of that already, but play that out in another decade, and now corporations must be doing good, not just generating profits. That's a big shift. We're going to have to be self-sufficient, so things like vertical farming, lab-grown proteins, to reduce the carbon footprint of cows that are farting all the time. We are going to have these sort of solutions, but we have the technology to fix this. We just don't have the political or economic will right now. And we have the technology to address homelessness. It costs about $3,000 today in 24 hours to print a family home out of this special form concretes that they use with these 3D printers that are can build these houses. So we have the technology to address these problems. We just don't have the will at the moment. And of course, climate resilience is going to be a massive part of investment, as we try and adapt humanity to these changing conditions, and that's all part of it. But of course, we're here to learn about banking. So I want to talk about banking in 2050, obviously. I gave you the macro view. Probably spent a bit longer on that than I had intended, but let's jump into banking. Now, we talk a lot about ecosystems today. And the ecosystem of banking in the future looks something like this in just a few years, in 2025. Primarily, every day today, most people are using technology to access banking. I know we've got some ABN AMRO folks here as an example. The data would tell us that for a bank like ABN AMRO, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, etc., for every one interaction you have with a human in a branch or a call center today, there are at least 350 interactions digitally. So the concept that banking is a human process today is sort of really blown out of the water. Yes, there are still some human interactions required in banking, but it is already dominantly digital. And when we have things like smart glasses and intelligent AIs that we can talk to, the need for a human in that interaction reduces. But what that means is the tech companies are now the gatekeepers of access to things like the utility of credit and so forth, because they own the technology layer that delivers banking in real time. You, of course, have the fintech specialists and the data brokers that are going to enable access to these different embedded finance experiences in real time. But the world of 2050 means that most of the economy is AI to AI machine-based, operated in a black box. We won't even necessarily know what those black boxes are doing anymore, but it will work and it'll be creating immense wealth, so we won't sort of argue about it. But these AIs will be doing a lot of transactions. Now, AIs could completely abandon the system of currency that we have. AIs could work on a bartering basis. The Uber AI could barter hours driven for access to, energy, for its self-driving electric vehicles, as an example. We really don't know how this is all going to play out, but what is interesting is in this world of economics, the ability of human arbitrage is dramatically reduced because we have to leave the system up to algorithms. And I get asked all the time, I've done a series on banking, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, when are you going to write Bank 5.0? Well, the problem is, Bank 5.0 is this autonomous economy. It is an autonomous, programmable markets without physical currency, completely digital cash. And in these economies of the future, we won't need banks. We won't need money in the conventional sense. In fact, we may trade very different things from what we have today. So when is this? Well, sometime between 2050 and 2100 is probably when we reach the stage of Bank 5.0. I could write a book on this, but it's for most people so sci-fi that it really doesn't matter. And talking about sci-fi, we are already starting to see that change. So last year, the Chinese mobile wallets did almost $77 trillion of transactions through their wallet ecosystem. All of the plastic cards in the world, just 38 trillion. So mobile wallets already represent about 300 to 400% of the transactional volume of classic bank accounts. If you were the bank and you're still issuing a plastic card, you're in the 1970s, wake up, we're here in the 21st century. This is mobile wallets we're talking about, right? And I'm not talking about just China, right? M-Pesa in Kenya, MTN Money in Nigeria and in Ghana, Paytm in India, with now 800 million people on that system in India. Gcash and Paymaya in the Philippines, Kakao in South Korea, PayPal, Venmo in the United States. The mobile wallet is the bank account of the 21st century, at least the first part of the 21st century. And the way we use money is going to be really determined by that. So obviously, being in a 21st century economy, we need 21st century identity. A passport or a driver's license isn't going to cut it. We need a digital identity framework that's more secure than your mother's maiden name, your date of birth, and a social security number. Those elements are never going to be securable ever again, right? So your face, your behaviour, these are things that we can attribute uniquely to you. And of course, smart glasses are coming. In January 2023, it's expected that Apple will release the iReality glasses, their new augmented reality, mixed reality headset. If you want to see what that might be like, this is a proof of concept, Project Aria, being tested by the team at Meta. And these smart glasses are designed to basically accompany you throughout life with a computing head-up mounted display interface in your field of view. These glasses map the world around you, so they use sensors like cameras and LiDAR to be able to trace objects. So when you're walking throughout the office, it'll identify objects like computers and so forth, people's faces. You could ask your smart glasses, hey, do you know where my car keys are? Do you know where I left them? And remember, you left them on the coffee table. Right? When you walk out into the real world and you're walking to get your morning coffee, your smart glasses will communicate with the AI in the coffee shop and give you your order, and you'll just gesture a payment or it'll automatically happen. Your offline preferences go into the online world and the online preferences into the offline world. Head-mounted displays combined with a digital wallet is this marriage between the digital and the physical worlds, as well as digital identity. So smart glasses are the next big consumer computing electronics. And this is how it might look in the short term in terms of your interaction. You walk into a Tesla dealership, you have the smart glasses, and it says, sorry, David, you should go to the Toyota dealership down the road. It's a bit expensive for you. And the waiting list is like 9 months long, by the way, right? And then when you think about things like buying a home in the world of smart glasses, when you walk into a listed real estate property, your smart glasses are going to automatically give you a home financing offer. If you're a bank that requires someone to come and ask for a mortgage, you're screwed in this world. Your business is gone, done. Because the one piece of data you need to be able to give someone a mortgage in real time is knowing the intent of someone to buy a home. And banks don't have that information. Apple has it. Google has it. Facebook has it. Banks don't have it. And so if you want to compete in the mortgage business, you have to be partnering with one of these data players, otherwise you're dead. Your business is dead. And don't get me even started. I'm talking about credit cards, right? And so the same goes for the metaverse, right? The metaverse, this digital world, you need to use digital wallets to be able to pay in this space. This is a clip from Ready Player One. He goes into this virtual world and this store, and he orders this haptic boot suit, the X1 boot suit. And he just gestures to do this, and the money comes out of his wallet. He has this hybrid wallet that has cash and points and other things in it. And there he goes in the real world now. He has access to his physical goods that have been shipped after he's bought this in the virtual store. So digital wallets are going to be the primary mechanism we use in the metaverse as well. And it doesn't matter, crypto, CBDCs, it's all going to be based on this mobile wallet technology. You're not going to swipe a virtual credit card on a virtual point of sale in the metaverse. We are in Amsterdam after all, right? But that's not how it's going to work. But sometimes sci-fi gets it wrong. This is a clip from the movie Total Impact. Here we go, with Colin Farrell. And it shows this interaction in a future bank. He walks into a branch with a teller window, right? Like, come on. And he has to give an account number to access his safety deposit box. Now, they do have biometric identification. That's pretty cool. But then when he actually gets to the safety deposit box, like, okay, maybe a digital vault, I can get that, but safety deposit box, he goes into his safety deposit box and he opens up his little thing. And what does he find? Well, he finds all his fake identities. He's a super spy, right? And he's got physical passports in 2045. He's got a physical passport, right? You know, come on. And then not only that, but of course, you know, he's got this other thing like this holographic rig and so forth in his gun. And then when it fades out, you can see he's got cash.
Of Britain.
So, yes. With Obama on a Britain dollar, 50. Obviously, bankers supported this show, right? But, you know, we are starting to see some sci-fi predictions come true. So this is Minority Report using iris recognition. We are already using facial recognition broadly for identification, coming into passport control here in the EU, of course, being used very widely in China with great effect. You know, I showed you those statistics on the Chinese mobile wallets. China, Alipay has 1/10,000th the rate of fraud of cards in the United States. 1/10,000th. Of course, this leads science fiction authors like William Gibson to say that in the future, money won't be illegal, you just won't be able to use it for anything, you know? It'll be a novelty. And I think that's a pretty interesting way of sort of thinking about this. But, you know, some sci-fi, like Cyberpunk and other games like this, you know, and other science fiction has proposed that we're going to have a global digital currency in the future. That was the idea behind Bitcoin, right? It was going to become the world's digital currency. And in Cyberpunk, they call them eddies. They're euro dollars. So there's the dollar and the euro combined. They call them eddies, euro dollars. But are we going to have a global central currency? The likelihood is we're actually going to have specialized currencies, CBDCs for wholesale trade, cryptos and tokens for retail trade, you know, stable coins in there. Programmable money doesn't necessarily have to be all one type of currency. As you get programmable, you program around form and function. And so we don't actually think that sort of a central global currency is probably going to be the way we go. You know, that's a fairly recent change. So in digitizing the planet, you know, we're not only digitizing money and identity, but we're also putting virtual real estate in the metaverse. We're also, you know, putting our DNA as a digital twin. You know, we're digitizing a lot of aspects of our economic system to try and make it communicate with AIs in the compute system from a data perspective. But do you really want your children's DNA on an open blockchain? So we do need to think about security and data storage in a different way. We need to think about how we do that. And yes, virtual real estate is an interesting thing, but is the metaverse a mechanism designed to distract us from the inequality we're facing because of techno-unemployment from AI? Some would have a cynical approach to that. Maybe that's what the metaverse is for. That's the story behind Ready Player One, right? They're in the stacks, they're on UBI, and they're happy because they're in Oasis every day, playing in the virtual world to distract them from the fact that they don't have a job anymore. Actually, I think we need jobs. I just don't think we need to be paid for jobs in the future, and that's what UBI really changes. But let's not forget, when we talk about virtual real estate, we still have to worry about physical real estate. And over 1 billion people are likely going to be displaced by climate change. And so how are we going to deal with that? Well, one proposal from science fiction is that we create a global carbon coin, that this is the way we measure economic activity, that we create a coin that measures your individual and your collective carbon footprint, and this is a way that we create healthy economic activity. In fact, Kim Stanley Robinson is one of the greatest thinkers in this space. But think about technologies like carbon capture and so forth. How do we encourage the market to do this versus just saying, well, it's not commercially viable right now? What incentives can we give the system to do the right thing? And then think about, where it goes if we don't have this. Dune, as a sci-fi story, is a great example of super capitalism, where neo-feudalism permanently separates the rich from the poor in this sort of advanced technological system. And then, you have Star Trek and Picard explaining here that money has disappeared in the 24th century, that we don't need money anymore, that humanity has gone beyond that. Well, that's maybe possible in 100 or 200 years, but the transition to this world is going to be messy and difficult. One of the ways we may make this transition to this sort of post-scarcity world is expanding humanity into the universe and solar system. And the question would be, what does it look like on Mars when we start to build habitats on Mars and colonize Mars? What sort of currency are we going to have in Mars? Do we need a capitalist system there? Well, the Martian economy is going to be geared towards survivability, sustainability, and prosperity of the whole colony. Surviving the fact that if the starships stop coming from Earth, that the colony can survive. This is a very different cultural imperative to what we have in the capitalist systems of today. So ultimately, how does this change society? Well, highly automated governments based on AI essentially become a DAO, a distributed or decentralized autonomous organization. That's the most efficient form of resource allocation in the future. But it means we blow up all of the concepts we have about governments, about governance, and about economies and the way they work today. So these are the 4 outcomes that we think are possible for the future. And all of these 4 will probably happen simultaneously. You'll have economies fail because they left it too late to react to climate change and AI. You'll have some economies try and ban AI because we have to keep humans working, right? And then you'll have this sort of maybe, say, Northern Europe or China versus the US type, philosophy. China is sort of wants to use technology to improve all of society, whereas the US wants to, have this sort of permanent class separation between the rich and the poor, and that technology is a way to accentuate that. At least that's what it appears to be. So we've got some big philosophical decisions to make about the future. I'll leave you with this thought. When we talk about banking in 2050, when we talk about all these changes we're going to go through over the next couple of decades, we really have to ask the question of what is the purpose of humanity? What sort of future do we want for our children, our grandchildren, our descendants? Do we want something based on making a dollar, making a dime, as the primary measure of human performance or activity? Or do we want a system that creates prosperity and advances the human race as a whole? AI will give us that opportunity. Capitalism will not. And so we have to really think about the transition of humanity to the next stage. And that's really what Banking 2050 is, or Bank 5.0, if you like, is really about. Thank you very much for coming along today. Check out the new book.